All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our third Back to the Basics 3-session program. In November, we looked at living a Jewish life, Shabbat, Kashrut, and Staka. In March, we looked at the calendar year, and we spent one session on the calendar itself, and then a session on the spring holidays and a session on the fall holidays. And this 3-session course is continuing that overall theme of back to the basics, but diving into life cycles. I'm really excited to share with you about birth and birth rituals and marriage rituals, which are the next 2 sessions, because I think that I have a way of looking at those that maybe you haven't been exposed to before. We're going to look at specifically what are the elements of the Brit Milah ritual, and why do I think that all Jewish children should be entered into the covenant on the 8th day. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at some examples of modern takes on those ancient rituals. And then when we get to weddings the following week, we are going to spend a large portion of our time looking at the wedding from the point of view of the efforts of the conservative movement to create a wedding liturgy for same-sex marriage. And what I really like about looking at it through that lens is it actually sheds a light on what straight marriage looks like. And it raises questions about what marriage is and what the meaning of marriage is and what makes Jewish marriage different from other marriage, secular culture marriage. And I'm really excited about those sessions, but I wanted to end on a happy note. So instead of doing birth, marriage, death, we're starting with death. I'm not excited to talk about death. I think that that our Jewish tradition handles death and mourning very, very well. I expect that the material that we'll cover tonight is relatively familiar to people, because at least in my experience in our community over the last 2 years that I've been the rabbi here, we've done more of the death and mourning rituals together as a community than we have birth or marriage rituals. So I expect that people have encountered these rituals more regularly in their lives, especially the folks, but especially in our community, right? We have an older population, and I do more funerals than any other life cycle event. But I think that taking some time to think about the meaning of the rituals is something that we don't always do, even as we attend funerals or we experience Shiva. And I'm looking forward to engaging with you on these traditions and why I think they're meaningful. So I've muted everybody, but you are welcome to unmute and interrupt at any time. And also, if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, just wave, and I'll see you and pause. So I wanted to start by saying I have 4 living grandparents and 2 living parents. And so I'm really blessed to have longevity in my family and to be fairly young. And so I've been really lucky in my life. But though my experience with death is more distant from a personal level, I have been very much engaged in connecting with people around death and dying. And I spent a couple of years as a hospice chaplain. So I wanted to start with that, and just to put my cards on the table and to let you know where I'm coming from in terms of how these rituals matter to me. When I talk about Shiva, I have not personally sat Shiva for a family member. You know, my siblings, thank God, are still alive. My parents are still alive. Even my parents have not sat Shiva for a close family member. And so, well, thank God. I'm very lucky in that way. Oh, I find Shiva to be very meaningful. And that meaning is at a certain distance. The flip side of that is, right, I was born with 5 great-grandparents and many, many aunts and uncles and cousins. Longevity runs in my family. And all of the people in those generations have passed on. And I didn't know them for, 4 years, like some people are born and they have a great-grandparent for 4 years. When my great-grandfather passed away, I was 25. I mean, I had long-term relationships with these folks. So I haven't not experienced death, but it is different. A great-grandparent is a different relationship than a parent or a sibling or a child. All right, so all of that is my personal background that I feel like it's important to put my cards on the table with regard to this. I used to think that when you died, you were gone. You'll have to ask me about it at a different time. It connects to a very rational approach to religion that I had growing up, in large part due to my parents learning from their teachers at the Jewish Theological Seminary, who in the aftermath of the Holocaust and had created a Judaism which was very concerned with the question of theodicy, of how there can be a good God with so much evil in the world. And they created, the answer is that God isn't powerful. Now, a less powerful God, a not all powerful God, can still be good, even in the face of evil. And that idea, that rationalism, basically created kind of a agnosticism around spirit and spirituality and the notions of spirit. And so I was surprised when I was sitting at people's bedsides as a hospice chaplain, and I experienced their presence lingering even after they had died. And I had to confront that lived experience of presence. And it forced me to change my theology. It forced me to change how I think about God and soul and spirit and afterlife and the whole kit and caboodle. I don't know whether any of you have had similar experiences of being forced to reconsider the deeply held beliefs that you grew up with, the beliefs that you held to be true as a matter of course, and that you then had to think about how to respond to it when it didn't quite match. But that is the theological experience that I had, in part as a result of being a hospice chaplain. I am now more okay with a sense of uncertainty around death and a sense of possibility, where I once would have said, I think when you're dead, you're dead. Your body stops functioning and that's it. I now think that there are mysteries that I do not understand. And I think that Judaism, in its multivocality, in its ability to hold many different truths simultaneously, Judaism makes space for that, for the possibility of not knowing, for the possibility of maybe. And I think that that's really beautiful. So that's how I wanted to start our conversation about death and dying, the mourning rituals this evening. And so at this point, I'm just going to pause and see if there's any comments or questions or thoughts, reactions. Okay, go ahead, you have to unmute, Judy.
As you know, I'm a retired physician, so I'm science bent. I had no grandparents, so that's not something I experienced. But when my mother-in-law died, I felt her presence for about 6 months. I don't know if it was real or an unwillingness to let her go because I loved her so much. I don't know, but I felt it. And then after 6 months, it was suddenly gone. When my mom died, nothing. Absolutely no presence afterwards. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Does your experience of a different experience with one versus the other lead you toward more of a sense of like possibility or mystery? Or if you had had the same experience for both?
We don't know. We don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Anita?
When we were speaking of death last week, I've lost my grandfather when I was about 8 or 9. My cousin Percy was killed in action in 1944, and they brought his remains back to be reinterred. And my mother had insisted that we go to we be included at the cemetery, small family. My father's hometown, essentially, that was the cemetery from Poland. Most of the people had come from that town, and in Niagara Falls, and so I experienced family death early. I felt stronger about Percy maybe than I did about my grandfather because Percy was more closer in age to me. My grandfather was an old man, not very communicative. But losing my mother, I lost my father early. I really didn't experience anything like that. But as I said last week, sometimes I will be somewhere and I will see somebody who's passed on. I mean, I see somebody who resembles them, and then I think about them. And I find that quite a lovely experience as a way to remember them and to have them in my life again for moments.
Jeff.
I don't usually have spiritual types of experiences, but after my grandfather died in 1987, I always have vivid dreams. And I remember it was about 6 months after he died, I had a very vivid dream, and it was the first time I felt really positive, like it was not depressing, it was a positive dream. And I remember my brother called me that day and started to say something. I said, wait, I got to tell you about this dream I had about Papa. And he's like, well, that's what I was calling you. He said, I had a dream, and he described this positive dream, and it was like, wow, that's wild that we both had this positive, really positive experience. We both wanted to talk about it, and I just remember that it was a long time ago.
Yeah. So I do think that it's okay to leave space for the possibility of science can't explain everything, and there are mysteries. There are things which are not purely rational, which exist in the world. And I think it's okay to not understand everything. All of that said, our rituals around caring for a person who has died and around comforting the mourners are largely very concrete and specific and circumscribed, and they create a real space for that kind of comfort, and that a ritual, and space for grief, and space for feeling whatever emotions you are feeling, but in a container that holds that very well. And from an anthropological perspective, we can understand those rituals very scientifically, but they also have great depth of spirit within them. And so we're going to talk about some of these rituals, and I will be honest that in preparing for this class, I reread Sarah Hurwitz's chapter on life cycle, and her chapter on the life cycle is life cycle rituals, well, mainly just death. And that's because she, as an unmarried woman in her 40s without children, didn't have a lot to say about marriage or birth. And she did have a lot to say about death, so she wanted to write what she knew. She didn't want to write something that didn't feel like it came from her. And I respect that, though I do think that there's a lot of value to all of the various rituals. And so we are going to trace a little bit through her chapter. And I think that she does a really beautiful job of sketching it out. She says, when someone we love dies, we may feel as if the world as we know it has been shattered, and we're suddenly forced to live in a new world of which we want no part. And when everyone is telling us that we need to be strong and get it together and act like everything is okay, Judaism says, no, actually, you're not okay. And you may feel this way for quite a while. And though you will slowly heal and eventually find your footing, this loss will always be with you. This will always hurt in some way. The secular world might expect us to act like nothing has happened, but Judaism certainly doesn't. Rather, it lays out a process that gives us the space to fully feel and express our grief, and that guides us forward, gradually helping us to re-enter life and to learn to live it again without the one that we love. And I will say, right, for a parent, the process of mourning is a year long, 12 months. And a few people have shared that sense of presence lingering. My own anecdotal evidence from people that I've talked to strongly places most of that kind of presence in the first year, within those first 12 months. Maybe there's some like spirit that lingers, and that is a part of your life and existence for 12 months. And certainly there is something to that in our traditions. So we're going to go through some of those traditions now. The first thing is that our Jewish tradition around taking care of somebody who has died is split into two parts. The first mitzvah is Liviyat Hamet, which comes from the word Livaya. Livaya is the Hebrew word for funeral. Sometimes you hear it pronounced as Levaya. Okay, well, are you going to the Levaya? You know, very kind of Ashkenazi Jewish way of saying it. But the mitzvah is Livayat Hamet, and it comes from the word livui, which means to accompany the one who has died. And so a levaya literally is an accompaniment, right? We translate it as funeral, but it really means to accompany. That's the first mitzvah. And the second mitzvah is nichum avilim, offering comfort to the mourners. And the first mitzvah applies from the moment of death to the burial, and the second mitzvah begins at burial and lasts for the whole year or for the month. The mitzvah of nichum avelim, comforting mourners, does not begin at the death. You might think it does, but in Jewish tradition, there's a special word, a special status for the people whose loved one has passed away before the burial, between death and burial. And those people are not called mourners. Okay, they are in a special status called onain. Aninut is the noun. Aninut is the state of being between death and burial, and you're not allowed, you're not even allowed in Jewish tradition to offer words of comfort to a person who is an onain. You are supposed to understand that the grief is so raw that words of comfort have no meaning. Now, do we do this? Probably not, right? We say, I'm so sorry for your loss. My deepest condolences, right? When I call and talk to people right after somebody has passed away, I do offer my sympathy and my empathy and my presence. And I do begin that process of comforting mourners even before the funeral. But the Jewish tradition is very clear that people in that category, you shouldn't say the traditional words of comfort, Hamakom yinachem etchem, God will bring you comfort, or may God bring you comfort, because God isn't bringing anyone comfort in those first couple of days. This comfort is not the thing for people who have just experienced a deep loss. And I think there's a real wisdom to that truth. I mean, I think that's something that we don't always think of, but wow, like, you're not even supposed to offer words of comfort until after the burial has happened. And from the perspective of the onein, of the person who is in aninut, person whose loved one has just passed away, that person is also exempted from all of the time-bound mitzvot. So that person doesn't have to put on tefillin in the morning. That person doesn't have to pray 3 times a day. That person, the only mitzvot that that person has to focus on doing are the mitzvot associated with preparing for the burial. And there are a lot of mitzvot that are incumbent on a person in that time period. So the body needs to be watched and never left alone. And so I've actually served a few different, couple times in my life as a shomer, as a guardian of a dead body during those days between the death and the funeral. Most recent time that I did that was for my great grandmother Malka, for whom I named Rachel and I named our daughter. Her middle name is Malka, and Grandma Malka passed away, and we each took a 4-hour shift between her death and the burial. And so I sat in the cold room with the body, and I recited psalms, which is the traditional thing to do during your guardianship. And so the first thing is that the body should never be left alone. So when we talk about the mitzvah of accompanying the dead person, like literally accompanying, like never leaving them alone. And we're not really talking about it tonight, but there's a kind of parallelism between that accompanying and the lahavdil, right? I'm making a distinction here, but there is a kind of symbolic parallel in some ways of the custom of accompanying the bride and groom in the days before their wedding, and not to leave them alone, because there's and also, by the way, the bride and groom are also exempt from those same kinds of mitzvot in the day before their wedding, because there's a real understanding that your focus is elsewhere. And if you can't be focused on the mitzvah, then you might as well, right, not necessarily even do it. You can't do it with intention. So the body is also washed and prepared for burial, and that requires a team of people called a Chevra Kedisha, a holy society. And the Chevra Kedisha washes the body with a lot of water. And the water has to be in buckets. It's not like a hose. You pour the water in buckets. And there's a particular procedure for how you wash the body, which parts you wash first. And you wash each limb individually. So first you uncover the right arm and you wash that arm, and then you recover it, and then you do the left and you recover it, so that the person is never just naked on the table, because every piece of this is about protecting the person's dignity. And there's a part of the tahara, the purification process, where the body has to be turned on the side to be able to wash the back. And there's a specific way that you do it, so that you're not invading the person's body. That ritual also is accompanied with some very traditional prayers, and some of the prayers are specifically directed to the soul of the person who has left, and some of them are directed toward a more generic, toward God or spirit or the divine in a more broader kind of way.
There is a Chevra Kadisha society in the United States that they meet periodically all over the country.
Yeah, most Chevra Kadisha are local. They are local groups, and that, to me, it's like a really important part of Jewish life is to have these Chevra Kadisha. You know, here in the Capital Region, the Orthodox community tends to take care of this for the rest of the community. I think that's a little bit unfortunate. I think we should all take responsibility for it, for making sure that this is done and done well and in a holy way. Also, liberal, progressive Jewish Chevra Kadisha have also created ways to understand how to care for people who are non-binary, who aren't comfortable with the gender pronoun he or she, who are queer, right? Because traditionally, a Chevra Kadisha has men and women, and the men care for men who have passed, and the women care for the women who have passed, and that doesn't work for everybody in today's world. And so there are Chevra Kadisha that have done some really, really wonderful work on the correct queer best practices around queer preparation of bodies. So then, as I said, the body is guarded and watched and made sure that there's an accompaniment. And we try to get to the funeral as soon as possible. So if somebody passes away on a Sunday, we try to have the funeral on Tuesday or Monday. If somebody passes away on Thursday or Friday, right, we try to have the funeral on Sunday if possible. Well, the only reason why we would extend the amount of time is if there are family that need to get there, that are traveling from farther, and there's no way to have the funeral without them. And so we do make allowances for that, but we try very hard to have the funeral on as close to the death as possible, which is not true of other faith traditions that don't have that same focus on burial as soon as we do. In the state of Israel, it is customary to have the funeral on the same day as the death, if possible. So, and they do funerals at night, which we in this country don't do. But in Israel, it is not uncommon to have funerals at night so that the funeral can happen within 24 hours of the death. Yeah, Barbie.
I've noticed that our Muslim friends, and Stan and I have some very close Muslim friends, father would die in the morning and by afternoon they have buried.
Yeah, Islam does have a similar approach to our approach on this. Yeah, Judy.
Do you think the last year with COVID has changed some of this, that instead of waiting for people to arrive, you Zoom it so that people don't have to travel long distance and it can be done faster?
It's a great question. It remains to be seen all of the ways in which this year has affected that. But I will say this, I did a funeral this Tuesday, and I don't think it would violate anybody's privacy to say that there was a conversation about whether somebody should fly in from California for the funeral, and the decision was made, well, since this is a person who would really want to be there, who is close family member, but since we were going to be streaming it anyway for other folks, this person chose to not like travel all the way across the country and back in the space of 48 hours for a ritual which lasts 45 minutes to an hour. And I do expect that people will be making that kind of calculus. And I do wonder if it will push us back to, burying as close to the death as we can. I think maybe it will shorten the time on average. So that remains to be seen. Hey, Gary.
Do hospitals today allow you to accompany the body the whole time?
It depends. It depends on the hospital. But yes, I mean, you can if you ask for it in most places. I imagine that there are also places where it's more difficult. But when I was, admittedly, I was in hospice residences, not in hospital, like not people who were in the hospital and on hospice, but like hospice residents. But at the hospice residence, if you asked, you could walk with the body when the Emmys, like when they came in and moved the body to the morgue in the basement of the building, you could walk all the way with them to the morgue, and then you could stay in that room until the family came to collect the body, or until the funeral home people came to collect the body. And there were a couple of times where I did that, where somebody had passed away, either with me sitting there or right before I walked in the door, and I sat with the body. They were mostly not Jewish folks, because most of the folks that I worked with weren't Jewish, but I still felt like some responsibility to accompany them, at least until they were put into the morgue. And so I would sit there and have a vigil for my, with the person. And you can ask to walk down with them. So that is possible. And I imagine that would be possible in many hospitals. There will also be places that make it less difficult, but make it more difficult. But we also have a tradition where, like, if you don't have to be in the freezer with the body, you know what I mean? Like the body can be in the refrigerator, and you can be standing outside in the room, or even in the next room over, and still be like close enough that you're considered to be accompanying the person. So, when I did my shmirah, I was in the cold room, but I couldn't see her. She was in the fridge, in her casket already. Like, she was ready for burial. And so, yeah. So that's my sense on that.
So with the COVID
Yeah.
crisis and the numbers of people who were dying in hospitals or nursing homes, and it seemed in certain communities, certainly, that there was not capacity even for them to be in a morgue. What kind of creative accommodations had been made? I know a friend in Boston lost her mother. She was at that large Newbridge on the Charles in the nursing home. And the best that they could, as it were, offer was that when the funeral home came to pick up her body, they could accompany it by car to the funeral home.
Mm-hmm.
That was the
Yeah.
best they could do at that point.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So we try to do the best possible thing that we are able to do.
Mhm.
Yeah. So when a person hears of a death of a close relative, parent, sibling, spouse, or child, the moment that you hear of the death, it can be marked with the recitation of the blessing, Baruch Dayan Haemet, blessed is the true judge. And you can do that blessing also, the more full form of it, with what we call Shem and Malchut, with the name of God, and Eloheinu Melech HaOlam, and Dayan Haemet, and the tearing of a piece of clothing that you're wearing. Well, nowadays, we don't tend to do this, but it is the tradition. When you hear, say, of your parents' death, you tear your shirt. Nowadays, we do it sort of ritually right before the funeral, and the rabbi facilitates with the family the tearing of the ribbons. And I'm just going to read another short little bit from Sarah Hurwitz, because I think she really describes this well. In recent times, finding the ritual of Kriya to be unseemly, many Jews began skipping it and instead simply tearing a black ribbon and pinning it to their clothing. But I think this substitution may miss the point. Kriya is supposed to be socially outrageous and primal. Mourners are not raising awareness for a cause. They are expressing the sense that their world has been torn apart. Kriya is Judaism's way of providing mourners a controlled outlet for the almost feral despair they may be feeling, the impulse to just shred everything around them. The point here isn't to try to protect mourners from what is happening, but to help them confront it. This is also true of the funeral itself, which is not focused on assuaging the mourner's anguish by assuring them that their loved one is in a better place. There is no attempt to paper over the magnitude of the loss. Rather, in addition to a handful of prayers and psalms, a Jewish funeral includes a eulogy, the purpose of which is, in the words of the Shulchan Aruch, the key Jewish law code, to utter over the dead person words which break the heart in order to cause much weeping and to mention his praise. So when we tear the ribbons, we're doing a sanitized version of the ritual. And I'm not saying don't tear the ribbon. I think that what's nice about the ribbon is then you can wear it on whatever clothing you happen to be wearing it. And I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to shift the ribbon from whatever clothing you're wearing, and if you're in mourning for your parent, to do so for a whole 30 days, not just for the week of Shiva. And then while you're going about your business, you have a visible sign to everybody that they can ask you about, and that you can say, yeah, I'm actually mourning for my parent. And I imagine that when, hopefully in many, many years, this happens to me, that I will want to tear an actual shirt or multiple shirts and wear torn shirts for the week, because I really think that what Sarah Hurwitz says here is right. Like, it's supposed to be socially outrageous. It's supposed to be primal. It's supposed to connect you to something visceral. Like, the world is never going to be the same again. Anita.
Yeah, when my father-in-law died, and they were members of Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan, my husband Arthur, and his brother were warned not to wear their best suits, that they should wear something that could be torn because they were going to be wearing it for a while. So they both found pullovers, sleeveless sweaters. Arthur had a sleeveless sweater, and the rabbi cut the neck, the shoulder part on it, and he wore that for the 30 days. You know, we washed it in between. Well, no, we didn't. He wore it every day when he went out. After he went out, because we were living in the New York metropolitan area. He was still going to work there.
Yeah, my grandfather, when his father died, cut a scarf and wore the scarf, like a ripped, jagged tear in a scarf, and then wore the scarf every day.
One time it was a tie. One
Yeah,
of the funerals,
I've seen that too.
it was a tie.
Yeah, Judy.
I do understand about the tearing, but I have to admit, with each family member's death, I was so overwhelmed, I never even thought about it. I wasn't avoiding it, I just never thought about it until the funeral, when they put on the torn ribbon. So
Yeah.
it didn't happen until that moment. I wasn't avoiding it, it just...
Yeah, I do think doing it at the funeral is ritually powerful. I like that we do it there. I mean, if somebody came to the funeral with already a shirt torn, I would also recognize that that person had responded to the tradition in that way. But I do think that there's something powerful about doing it right then. And it also marks the fact that, you know, mourning doesn't really start until after the burial is over, right? So the funeral is sort of a dividing line. And like this thing, the tearing, it's actually not part of mourning. It's like an expression of grief that's beyond mourning. It's primal. That's why we do it before the funeral and not at the end of the funeral, right? But I do think that there's something powerful about doing it, you know, as part of that whole ritual. And I have no problem with the ribbon, right? I do try to give every mourner the option, right? So, and you might hear me say that if you come to funerals that I'm officiating at. I'll describe the ritual of the tearing, and I say pretty much the same thing every time. And I always offer the opportunity, if you'd like to tear a piece of clothing, you can do that instead, or in addition. So then we do the burial, and burial in the Jewish tradition is in a simple, a plain pine box, a simple casket. A person is wrapped in tachrichin, in a shroud, but is not embalmed in any way. Right? The process of decomposing is part of what we expect from death. And in Israel, the only reason why you would be buried in a box is if you died in a violent way. And so then the box protects the dignity of the person who might be wounded in a big way. But everybody else, the person who just dies in the hospital, most deaths in Israel are just a shroud and no box. Because of the importance of decomposing. Yeah, Barbie.
The talit, Rabbi.
Yes, some people
in
choose
Israel.
Some people choose to be buried in a talit, and that usually, if you're going to be buried in a talit, the talit is cut. A corner of it is cut off so that you're not buried in a functional ritual garment, but in one which is not functional. And then yes, that is common also to be buried in a talit. My own sort of feeling around the talit thing is, if you have a child or a grandchild who would have spiritual significance in wearing your talit, in having that be passed down, then that, to me, that feels like a better use of the talit than being wrapped in it in the casket. Barbie.
Excuse me, you mentioned that we don't embalm, and I know that. What happens if we die out of state or out of country? Do we have to be embalmed to be transported back to our home territory?
I don't know the answer to that question. My guess is, I don't know. I will have to look that up. My hunch is that there are short-term preservation things that can be done that are not embalming, like that we would ask no, not to have any preservatives injected into the body, but to have more short-term methods used, like deep freeze. Okay, that's my hunch. So then the funeral includes the burial, and we've all experienced that, where we mark our reluctance to perform the mitzvah of burial by shoveling backwards with the cup side of the shovel down, and to use the back side of the shovel. It's not easy to do. And I think that feeling of this isn't easy to do is exactly the feeling that we're supposed to have. And it's my understanding that you should bury at the funeral up till the top of the casket, so that you cannot see the aron anymore. And that's what we do in our community. Yeah, Nita.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, to me, the worst sound in the world is that first shovel of dirt hitting the coffin. It just makes me go cold every time I hear it.
Yeah.
Sort of an echo of finality to it.
Yes.
It really does.
Yes.
It is quite a sound.
Yeah, you know then that the person is gone.
Yeah. And I think that's part of why we do it, right? That sense of finality is an important step in the grieving process. It's an enforced end to denial, if a person has any denial, which we do, right? Denial is a part of grief, but the Jewish death and mourning practices force us to confront our denial. I think it's very powerful. Yeah, Mark.
Rabbi, could you talk a little bit about the Jewish take on cremation, whether it's totally illegal or has that changed?
So you're supposed to be buried whole. Not only are you supposed to be buried as whole as you can, right? There's a question in Judaism about whether you can do, say, an autopsy or do organ donation. Now, the answer to both of those is yes, if there is a significantly important reason to do autopsy, you can, right? And if you have donated your organs, you can do that. And right, there was a question of, is this permitted in Jewish law, given our huge focus on being buried whole? So that's one first sort of layer on this. The second layer is there have been different Jewish customs around death and burial practices over the course of Jewish history, right? The Bible describes sort of an idea of Jewish death where a person was sort of entombed in a central like burial location for the family until the body had decayed, and then the bones were moved to an ossuary, to a place where, right, all of your family's bones were collected in one ossuary, one collection of bones. And there's a phrase in Hebrew in Torah that describes death, and the phrase is "Ve'asef el amav," gathered unto his people. And there have been some biblical scholars who have said that that is referring to this practice of moving the bones to the ossuary, to the collection of other bones. That literally, it's not figurative, that it's not like he's going to join his relatives in heaven, right? That isn't the biblical idea. That it's actually very literal. His body decayed and the bones were gathered unto the people. Oh, very interesting, right? That our sense of what Jewish burial is, that it has to be in this way, and it has to be a whole body, and it has to be within 24 hours, all of that sort of stuff, like, is relatively new in the last 2,000 years. I mean, we've been doing it for 2,000 years or 2,500 years, but there was a practice that predated that. And there have been Jewish communities where cremation was an acceptable route. Burial was always the main form of Jewish ritual, but there had been there are some sources that describe a relative acceptance of cremation. So that's the second level. The third level is a lot of folks after the Holocaust and all of the cremated bodies of Jews, all of the ash that you can still see in the death camps. Like if you go to Majdanek, there's like a pile of ash there that's dead people. And so in recent decades, there's definitely been folks who are like, well, even if I would have considered cremation, I certainly won't because of the Holocaust connection to it. So that's a third level. Then there's a fourth level, which is most people, when they consider cremation, they do so because they want to take up less space in death. I mean, that's not everybody's reason. That's not everybody's reason, but it is a common reason that people say, you know, I don't need a whole cemetery plot. I want to take up less space. Like I want to become ashes or dust and go onto dust just as I was, you know, right, the dust onto dust idea. And that isn't a Jewish formulation of that idea, right? But that's what most people are thinking about. And some people are thinking about the environmental impact of burial. We take up a lot of space in the ground, and then that ground can't be used for anything else. And like, there's an environmental challenge there. So I have been taught that the environmental, what it costs in carbon footprint to cremate someone is a worse intrusion on the environment than having a body decompose naturally. Now, if you're decomposing in a plastic container that is buried in the ground, and the plastic container isn't going to decompose for millions of years, right? That's different. And most of us will be buried in plastic containers because that's the way most cemeteries are in this country. And certainly in our cemetery, everybody's buried in a plastic container. And so that's, I mean, it's a plastic container, and then they put the wooden coffin in the plastic container. I don't personally know the science around this, but I have been told that cremation is not environmentally friendly as people think it is. My own feeling is that if you want to take up less space, it makes sense to try to find a green cemetery, a cemetery where they're not using all of the big plastic containers and other stuff like that, as opposed to doing cremation. And I find the idea of being buried whole to be like deeply spiritually meaningful. But if you came to me and said, I want to be cremated, will you still do my funeral? Which some rabbis will not. I have done funerals of cremated remains, and I believe that you should have the rituals and prayers recited over you even if you have been cremated. Some rabbis will not do that, but this rabbi will.
What about burial by sea?
Oh yeah, so burial by sea is another example of, like, there have been Jewish communities in the past who have done it. So, but it isn't the most common form of Jewish burial, but it can be done. Again, with burial by sea, we're talking about a full body, not cremated remains then scattered on the ocean, but a full body. There is a recent trend to do not cremation, but an acid bath, and then your bones are buried. Right? It takes care of all of the living matter. The most recent teshuvah legal responsum in the conservative movement around that suggests not to do that.
That sounds horrible.
Yeah.
I want to add, for a lot of people, cremation is a more economical answer.
I'm not sure that that's true either. I mean,
Seems to be what people are saying. I don't know either.
So my sense is that the actual costs of the super hot oven that cremates you is sort of equivalent in some respects to the actual costs of burial, but then there's also the cost of buying the plot of land.
Right. I think that's the balance for a lot of people.
I hear you.
So scattering ashes in sea is not acceptable.
It is not
I've
the
been to
preferred
funerals like that.
Yeah, it is not the preferred method of Jewish burial. Again, like, if these things are done, even though they're not the preferred method, like, I still think that the person deserves and should have a Jewish funeral. So if, say, you are, let's say your father has remarried, and so his next of kin, your stepmother, refuses to honor your desire to bury your father according to Jewish tradition and instead cremates him, right? Which that does happen. We hear about, situations where people's extended family do not always do what you hope that they would do with regard to people's end of life wishes. Or say that your father really wanted to be cremated and you want to follow his last wishes, even though it isn't according to your tradition of Judaism. All of these sort of situations, right? If the question is, look, I'm gonna do the cremation, cremation is happening, can we still have a funeral? The answer is yes. Jeff.
Yeah, I just had a question. You mentioned at the cemetery, our cemetery, I wasn't aware that we were being buried in plastic. I thought there were concrete liners that we had mandated and with holes in them so that, you know, the decomposition can take place. I didn't know there was any plastic involved.
Yeah, so they might be concrete. They might be concrete instead of plastic, but I think they're plastic. I mean,
We had long conversations over this when it was determined that too many of the graves were caving in and that it needed some sort of support, and the concrete, which isn't completely, I don't even think it's four-sided. I'm not sure, but that was
Yeah.
my thinking.
Well, I don't know that. I don't know the answer. I
Sided concrete.
Yeah, I know that I have seen like plastic being used.
I think what we use is concrete. Bob is waving his hand there. I think he wants.
Yeah.
Yep, Bob. You have to unmute Bob. We can't hear you because you're muted. You have to unmute. Bob.
Unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay. The Committee on Jewish Laws and Standards has a ruling on cremation that was published around 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's the purpose of the rabbinics to discourage people who plan to be cremated not to do it.
Yes.
And the reasons for not doing cremation in the Jewish faith is similar to that in the Catholic faith. But if a person decides to be cremated, then they can be buried in a Jewish cemetery, but they have to be placed, the remains, in a biodegradable container. 2, a conservative rabbi cannot officiate in the cemetery at the burial of the cremated materials.
Yeah, I would.
If the body can be brought into a shul in a coffin, and a rabbi can officiate before cremation occurs. There are other rulings on it. We have at least a half a dozen cremated materials in our cemetery, and we go according to the rulings. Cremation, I feel, has not been one having to do with money as much as a person wants to have the body cremated so that it will not decay and go through the decaying process. And I've had a lot of experience in this on people deciding to do this before they were cremated. But it is in the country. Now, what we do in our cemetery is we have a Reform rabbi officiates at a burial. And we've gone through, pardon me?
I would.
We've gone through at least over maybe around 8 or 9 cremations over my 21 years.
Okay.
It had to do with the liner in the grave.
Yeah. All right. I will follow up and find out exactly what we have.
Well, Bob knows. He can answer that.
What I saw for the last burial was plastic. And
Right.
I've got to say, I was really surprised because it had been concrete.
Yeah, it had been.
But
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
last one was plastic.
I think a lot of them this year have been plastic.
I think so too, yeah. It used to be concrete because they needed a small crane to lift it before. And place it over the wall liner. And now it's just two guys grab the plastic piece and put it in place. Finish up with the soil over it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the most recent writing in the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards on this topic is Jeremy Kolmanovsky's paper from 2017. And he says, he goes through all the different possible options, and he says it's a mitzvah to bury the dead. And that is also what I would tell you if you came into my office and asked. But if somebody came and they were already cremated, I would definitely perform at that funeral, and I would not be kicked out of being a conservative rabbi for doing so. There are many conservative rabbis who would do that. It is not one of our standards of practice, right? Like officiating at an intermarriage is a standard of practice. If you do that, you are no longer can be considered a conservative rabbi. But officiating at a funeral of cremated remains is not rise to the level of that. So there may be other conservative rabbis who would not do it, but I would do it in an after the fact sort of situation. Yeah, Barry.
I have a question about the instead of a wooden coffin, are they using biodegradable cardboard?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't think I've ever seen anybody in biodegradable cardboard. A pine box will decompose within about a year. Well, the pine box is it's a pretty biodegradable option. So that's what I would recommend. I mean, it's an interesting question. I will ask around and see if there's anybody who knows of that practice. All right, Larry.
Is it acceptable in Judaism to be buried above ground in a crypt?
Yeah, a mausoleum burial is also one of the teshuvot of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. And I think what they come down on is it is not recommended. In Manhattan and northern Jersey, there are very few cemeteries, and there are many, many, many people. And, you know, there are no cemeteries in Manhattan that are active cemeteries. You have to go to Queens or to New Jersey. If you're a rabbi in Manhattan and you're doing a funeral, it takes an hour to get there, no matter how you get, you know, no matter where it is. I mean, it's a project. So in many of those cemeteries, they are confronting their space issues by having mausoleums. And while that is not the preferred method for a Jewish burial, I have been at Jewish funerals that are at mausoleums, with interment at mausoleums. Yeah, so that I have experienced that. It wouldn't be my preference for my own remains, but sometimes that's that's what there is.
I'm going to ask another crazy on this topic already. We're beating it up, but is there a depth? Is there a depth, and can there be sort of one on top of another?
Yeah, again, that's a good question that I'm not 100% sure about the answer. It's certainly, certainly in like Jewish cemeteries in Poland, that was done. Like
I just.
What they do at the Veterans Cemetery.
Yeah, I mean, in Jewish cemeteries in Poland, you sometimes had overlapping gravestones, or you had places where, you know, where a person had been buried deeper, and then you could bury somebody more shallow, or, you know, that tends not to happen in the United States, and there are rules about it in most cemeteries. I used to think that a lot of the cemetery ordinances were governed by state law, and there are some state laws around burial and rules, but a lot of them are actually cemetery ordinances, that it's the cemetery that makes the rule.
Rabbi, the veteran cemeteries do one on top of the other.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, but I believe you. I mean,
that's correct.
Yeah, I don't have any personal.
Well, I do.
Yeah. Bob.
First of all, you're permitted to have more than one coffin in a burial ground. The rule with the Chevra Kadisha is you can have two caskets in the same grave if they are separated by 18 inches of earth or a slab of concrete. The Mount Sinai Cemetery, which is new in Phoenix, has concrete liners were placed in the ground when they built the cemetery. And the concrete liners are 9 or 8 feet deep. And they're called companion graves. And they permit there a husband and wife to be buried, and they separate it by the earth or the slab of concrete. But that's the situation throughout the whole cemetery. In Europe, and by the way, Elliot Dorff was very surprised to hear about this from me. When you went to Prague, Budapest, and those places, they have buried 5 or 7 deep in those cemeteries going years back. So it is permitted. We almost had a double burial in our cemetery, which the Chevra Kadisha approved to separate by 18 inches. So that is permitted. The mausoleum situation is the following. The only cemeteries that permit, Jewish cemeteries that permit mausoleums, whether community or private, are the Reform. But the Mount Sinai Cemetery in California, which is the largest Jewish cemetery out and the most modern, has a community mausoleum burial in a mountain. And I've been there around 3 or 4 times. And it's been approved by the conservative rabbis out of Israel, because each 3 sides are surrounded by earth, around 3 or 4 inches of earth, and they will permit the mausoleum burial. I have discussed with Rabbi Elliot Dorff the use of what's called companion mausoleums, which are on the ground, maybe 4 feet high by 8 feet by 9 feet, permitting that on the ground, providing it is surrounded by 6 inches of dirt. There's another cemetery in San Diego, which also has the mausoleum built into one part of a mountain, which has been approved by the Orthodox. I predict that within 20 to 30 years, conservative cemeteries will permit community mausoleums, which to me is the way to go, a preferred way to go, providing it's surrounded with dirt. With respect to the use of concrete liners that was brought up, the use of concrete liners is approved by the Chevra Kadisha throughout the country, providing there are holes drilled in the four corners of the bottom of the liner. Some have more than holes, some have sections of it. The plastic ones that are being done now, and it's being done for economics only, should have 4 or 5 inch holes drilled in the four corners of the plastic container to conform with the Chevra Kadisha's rules. That's it.
Yeah, my own preference would be to not have any concrete or plastic. I would prefer to just be in the ground. But I understand that you don't always get what you want. We are running low on time. Just going to quickly sketch out some of the rest of the mourning practices. I'll start with Shiva. Shiva is that first 7-day period from the funeral, 7 days, and the day of the funeral counts for one of the 7, as does the final day. So it's really, if you have the funeral, say at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, you really sit Shiva from, say, 1 p.m. on Tuesday until right after Shachrit on the following Monday morning, right? And so on that Monday morning, right after Shachrit, you then can get up from Shiva, and it's traditional to literally get up and to take a walk around the block to symbolize the end of Shiva. And I do that. I offer that to congregants who would like to take a walk with me, and to do that accompanying the mourner, to do that comforting the mourner at the end of Shiva. Shiva traditionally is a time where you don't do anything. You sit on the floor of your house. People come and visit you. People come and bring you food. When you visit a Shiva house, it's traditional to walk in to say the one line of Hamakom Yenachem Etchem B'tok Sha'ar Avalei Tzion V'Yerushalayim to the mourner, and then to be silent. A Shiva house is supposed to be silent, and silent from the perspective of the visitors. Visitors to a Shiva house shouldn't speak unless the person who is mourning speaks to them. And the person who is mourning can choose to just sit in silence, and then your visit passes in silence, and then you leave. And when you leave, you also say the same formula, Hamakom Yenachem Etchem B'tok Sha'ar Avalei Tzion V'Yerushalayim, and then you leave. And you can stay, if you're coming not connected to a service, it's appropriate to stay for 25 minutes or 30 minutes or 35 minutes, but you don't stay for a long, long time. You come, you visit, you leave. And the whole community gathers for the services for Mincha or Mariv at the home of the person who is sitting Shiva. Sometimes there's laughter in a Shiva house, but it's when the mourner is telling a story that's funny. If the mourner is setting that tone, then it's perfectly acceptable to laugh with the mourner in memory of the person, right? Sometimes there's crying in a Shiva house, and that is also perfectly acceptable. But a Shiva house is supposed to be a way that the community holds the mourner in the mourner's grief, however that is manifesting itself. Sometimes the mourner will have pictures or photo albums out, and you're allowed to look at the photo albums, and you can ask maybe a short question about it, or if the mourner sees you looking, then the mourner might share something about the pictures that you're looking at. You could you could tell the mourner a story about the person that they're remembering if the mourner has already spoken to open the conversation about stories, right? But if the mourner is sitting quietly for the time that you're there, you're supposed to sit quietly for the time that you're there. My sense is somebody asked about, I think it was Judy asked earlier about how COVID will have shifted things. I expect that now that we've done so much on Zoom this year, that in the future there will be posted Shiva hours that will be in person and posted Shiva hours that will be on Zoom. So I expect that if the funeral is on Tuesday, we'll have, like, Tuesday night will be in person, but Wednesday and Thursday night might be on Zoom, because I think that there's been a real amazing thing that you can have Shiva and have people from Israel and Germany and California all come to Shiva and to be with you in your house. And I don't think that's going away. I also think that there's sometimes the family of the mourner feels an obligation to be hosts. And that's exactly the opposite of what Shiva is supposed to be. The family is not hosting the community at their house. The community is actually coming into their house to do this act of comforting. And when we have this anxiety around hosting, you can feel like, oh, if I don't have to have all these people traipsing through my house, that's actually way more comforting for me. And so I do think that people will choose Zoom for that reason as well. But in the ideal sort of situation, Shiva isn't a place where, like, there are trays of cookies for the community to come over and eat. It should be a place where there are casserole dishes of food that the community brought over for the mourner to eat, so that the mourner doesn't have to prepare any food. And so I do think that sometimes we've lost a little bit of the way that Shiva is supposed to help the community to comfort the mourner. From the perspective of the mourner, that 7-day period is also a time where you might feel like you want to just be alone. And the tradition says, nuh-uh, this is a time for the community to hold you. At this time where you feel lonely and isolated and bereft and grief-stricken, where the world is never going to be the same and you feel totally abandoned by the person who left, and how could it be that this person isn't a part of your life anymore, and all of that, the Jewish tradition says, but you are held. You have a community. You have social relationships. You have people who love you. Yes, there's somebody who's gone, but you can't isolate. You have to be in the presence of other people. And I think that's a huge, huge spiritual truth, and like an important part of what Shiva is. Barbie.
Can you explain how the Shiva works when it, is interrupted by Shabbat?
Yeah. So Shabbat doesn't end Shiva. Shabbat is a pause on aspects of mourning which are public mourning. So on Shabbat, you don't have to sit on a low stool. On Shabbat, the mourner can come to the synagogue for services as opposed to the community coming to the mourner's house. On Shabbat, you don't wear the ribbon or the torn shirt. Wear a different shirt for Lichvod Shabbat. And so the public mourning aspects stop on Shabbat. But the private mourning aspects, like that you're still really sad and that you don't really do anything and that you're just sort of in a state of grief and memory, those things are still part of it. So the Shabbat counts in the 7 days, is part of that week. Holidays are different. There is a Jewish tradition, and it's one of the things that I find to be fairly difficult about. Like, I love Jewish death and mourning. I think that Judaism has got this right. You know, like, I think there's real spiritual wisdom in these traditions. This one is hard. When there's a Shiva that is interrupted by a holiday, that is a Yom Tov holiday, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the holiday ends Shiva. And the sort of idea there is there are some moments where the community's joy is stronger or more important than the individual's grief. Now, usually, a person's grief the community is responsible for comforting that mourner. But sometimes, like when there's a big holiday, the Jewish tradition actually preferences the needs of the community over the needs of the mourner. And the needs of the community, say for Passover, are to not have to worry about also doing Shiva as part of Passover. Because Passover is a time of joy and celebration and family, and everybody's with their own family. And doing Shiva over Passover is not practical for a community. And Sukkot is the time of our joy. And it is incompatible with Sukkot to be doing mourning practices as a community. And so a person might feel very sad, an individual might have grief, but in those moments, the needs of the community are stronger, they outweigh in Jewish tradition the need of the individual. And that can be very, very hard for the individual. You know, we just did a burial on Erev Shavuot, and then there wasn't Shiva afterward. So we did have a couple of evening services where the family came and we did share memories, but we didn't do the changes to liturgy for House of Mourning. And so it wasn't Shiva. And that is very hard. Shloshim also ends from Chag. So if you bury your family member in the month of Elul, you know, not the first day of Elul, but at some point in Elul, when you get to Rosh Hashanah ends the Shloshim mourning practices. The worst sort of case of this is if you bury somebody between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur ends Shiva, and 5 days later, when you get to Sukkot, Sukkot ends Shloshim. So that person's mourning is extremely abbreviated. Edith.
Yeah, my mother died on Yom Kippur and was buried one day before Sukkot. And that was the end of that. And there's really nothing worse than not being able to mourn with the minion after the death of a parent. And yeah, I really felt for the Westheimers I know exactly how that feels, except they, you allowed for services afterwards. And in my case, that never happened. And there was a death and there was a funeral and, wipe your hands of the whole thing. That was it. So
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really, really hard. I do think that there's wisdom in it too. The wisdom is in the needs of the community and the joy of the festival. But it really, really is hard for the people who have just suffered a loss.
Are people thinking about a creative way around that? Maybe a something, at least some sort of closure for the mourner to advance maybe to the next the next step or something?
Well, there is, right? Like Shiva ends and Shloshim starts. So, right? So, and the mourning for Shloshim is, there's still a lot of practices in the mourning for Shloshim that are concrete practices.
I wanted to ask that.
And I don't know whether there's, I think that even though it's hard for the individual, I think that in every tradition you have to also consider the needs of the community, and the holding a person through Shiva is an enormous demand on the community's resources. And I do think that there is a real wisdom of a sort in saying, the community can't do that and celebrate the holiday in the way that the holiday should be celebrated. I don't know.
Go back after the holiday.
How about a sort of a time after the holiday, or establishing a substitute Shiva in a way?
I've seen that done, and it's different, right? Time has passed. The feeling of immediacy is gone, and you don't ever get that back. That's sort of a once kind of thing, and that's hard. It's really hard. So we have Shiva. We just talked about. It's customary, by the way, during Shiva not to drink wine or eat meat, except for on Shabbat. And the first meal after a funeral is usually lentils or hard-boiled eggs. Hard-boiled eggs and lentils, which both sort of signify kind of the cycle of life, but also which are very like kind of the poor man's food. I mean, they're very sort of not fancy fare, and that's what you're supposed to eat during. You're not supposed to eat foods which are joyful, like meat and wine, according to the tradition. Yeah, Mark.
I think we should let you go to bed before your kid wakes you up.
Yeah, I'm for that too. I appreciate I appreciate that. So all right, so we'll come to a close here. We will return next Thursday night. We will be looking at birth, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some of the aspects of rituals around birth and naming, and also to think about covenant in general. Also, thank you so much for joining with me this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I look forward to learning with you again next week.
Yes, thank you.
Yashikoach.
Yeah.
Latov.
Shabbat Shalom. Coming.
Lila Tov.